you don't know why you did certain things, how can you make decisions about what to do next?
Welcome to Dev Talk with Dan. I'm joined by Jessica DePice, exploring the secrets to successful digital project management. Meet Jessica DePice, a digital project manager with 7 years of experience driving innovation in pharma, biotech, and healthcare. She's led cross-functional agile teams, developed SaaS products, and has expertise in product roadmap development, technical ambassadorship, and customer-centric approaches. Welcome, Jessica.
Great to be here, Dan. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start by sharing some of your journey to becoming a digital project manager.
Sure. So I was one of those people who I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I went to film school. I worked in talent acquisition. I was a wine director at one point of a restaurant in DC or near DC. I've worked in the massage industry. I was really just trying to figure out where am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing? But the thread through all of it that tied everything together was software. I really liked using software to solve problems. Something as simple as setting up a simple spreadsheet to track clients or pricing for products, or something as complex as figuring out how to configure a piece of software for advanced video tracking and live performance. Whatever it was, I was very interested in that because it was interesting, energizing for me, rewarding, and I wanted to learn more. So in 2017, I went into IT as an analyst, and I was focused on deeply understanding the requirements and working with stakeholders and vendors to implement various out-of-the-box business systems for various companies across various industries. So we're talking LMS systems for health informatics companies, software asset management, and centers of excellence, even like center of excellence models for federal and state rights management for a broadcast company, you name it, I've probably done it. And then in 2022, I joined as an analyst a diagnostics laboratory implementing their CRM and ERP systems. And when the lab was acquired and my team was cut, I then went into consulting for a contract research organization focused on implementing SAP ERP for their acquired entities. And again, it's all about understanding the requirements, working closely with stakeholders, working with developers. And those transferable skills of spending years being an analyst just naturally transferred to me joining the contract research organization permanently as a technical product manager, really, focused on building scalable, reusable digital services and components to support the platform that enabled their clients to estimate drug discovery services, track preclinical studies, purchase animal models, and engage with other products and services offered by the organization. And that's how I kind of got where I am today.
Wow. But the first step in all of that is understanding the customer's needs to
Yes,
configure the platform to meet those requirements.
exactly.
So, what would you say particularly shaped your career being in the pharma and healthcare industry?
So the reason that I wanted to get into that particular industry so badly is in 2017, someone who I considered a sister, like we called each other sisters, even though we weren't biologically related, she passed away due to cancer. She had been in and out of remission for the amount of time that I knew her. But it ultimately took her life. And watching somebody die like that was probably one of the hardest things I've ever been through, if not the hardest thing I've ever been through. And the thing that I think about every day, I literally have a tattoo of her name on my wrist so that every single day I look at it and I say, I don't want anybody to ever have to go through what she went through or experience what I experienced. So that's what drives me. And even if it's something as removed as working on software that enables scientists to discover treatments for cancer or treatments for any other, life-threatening or even life-inconveniencing disease, that's something that I want to contribute to.
Right. In those research efforts, there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle that make the reality come to life.
Absolutely.
So in digital project management, we find a lot of alignment with Agile methodologies as well. Um, how do you prioritize things like features? and manage the backlog for these particular kinds of projects?
Sure. So prioritization to me is usually based on organizational goals, which usually consist of buckets that you'll usually find these overarching or non-specific goals or even specific goals in, and they're usually going to be impacting revenue generation, cost savings, or cost avoidance. So to me, the greatest potential impacts to any of these buckets takes priority. So if you have a feature that's going to, say, save the time and effort of a developer or save the time and effort of any other person on a team, that's going to be a cost savings feature, and that's going to be a priority based on that. And then if there's a feature that unlocks revenue generation potential, that's going to be a priority. And depending on the analysis of that feature and the potential for revenue generation, that's how it's going to determine competing priorities. So if there's no impacts to any of those buckets, yes, there is, and you need to find it and figure out how to track it and gather data on it.
Right. If you think it doesn't have it, it has it. You just
It
didn't find
absolutely
it
does.
yet.
Yes, and you need to figure out what data points you need to track in order to really show that impact.
So taking those metrics into consideration as you prioritize a backlog for scheduling work, how do you ensure successful sprint planning and execution?
Sure, sure. And that's always a unique challenge for lots of different teams. But to me, where I've really had success was really ensuring that the backlog refinement is done on a consistent basis, that it's done with the entire team, the entire Agile team, and that there is a knowledge that the entire team can speak in that, like, they can speak to whatever their knowledge base is, and they should be contributing to the conversation around how a certain feature, certain piece of work should be executed, how it should be implemented. And then once your backlog is really refined, once your work is really in a good state where you understand the who, the what, the why, the acceptance criteria, what it means for a piece of work to be done, then once you have all of that in line, you can start to say, okay, let's estimate this as a team. And usually for me, I'm estimating while we're refining the backlog. That's happening at the same time. So that once you get into sprint planning, you're not just trying to go, oh crap, how much effort do we think this is? Hurry up. It's we know how much work we have behind us, how much work we need to put in front of us, and based on whichever resources are going to be available within that sprint, how much you can fit. And so it really helps if your backlog refinement is solid and consistent and continuous. Your sprint planning should be much, much easier.
Yeah, having the contribution of the team in deciding the strategy for the implementation of things reduces the unknowns that prevent you from being able to estimate things. I think a lot of teams jump into estimating. Well, one, there's a fear that they're going to get it wrong, right? But
Yeah.
that means they're not taking into account the unknown portion of that or the complexity of it, because those are all components in your estimation. And the newer the concept, the newer the feature, the less defined it is. So the more uncertainty there is, so the less accurately you can estimate it. And you just need to communicate that all the way across, right? But like you said, as you continue to refine those, they get closer to the top, which means they're closer to being accepted in a sprint. They become more well defined. And so you can more easily size them. And oftentimes size is one of the things we use to prioritize them. Like this is too big or this is small and really valuable and it should come first.
Oh yeah, there's actually a quadrant system that I've often used of low effort, low price, or was it low effort, low reward, high effort, low reward, high effort, high reward, low, and so forth. And that usually, especially if I've got really close competing priorities, that'll sometimes help me if I can map it out in that quadrant to say, okay, this is something that we need to throw out. This is something that we need to do now. This is something that we can do a little bit later. And it just does help with that. I've provided that template to a few other colleagues and other people, and it's helped.
Yeah. And a lot of times, just plain old return on investment is one of the best metrics you can use. If there isn't any, maybe it doesn't need to be in there. Yeah.
Exactly.
The
Oh my gosh, yeah.
and there always ends up with some of those in there. Fortunately, they never seem to make it to the top to get worked on, but that clutter in the backlog is also a distraction.
Definitely. And it's the decluttering is such a an important piece for the team because if you're cluttered, you don't know what to pull forward. Because ideally, and I've seen teams do this, you're not just throwing things into the backlog to be forgotten. You're putting it there because it's not quite time yet to either, really refine it or there's something that you're aspirational to that'll come later that you'll end up refining later. But I've seen too often people just throwing stuff into the backlog that has no reasoning behind it. There's no like any sort of documentation. I know documentation can be a bad word in Agile sometimes, but you do need some. You need to be able to communicate to your team and to yourself what something is and what it means. And so the number of times I've seen just stuff in the backlog, I'm like, what is this? What does it mean? What's the value? So
And I often see things that got put in the backlog with best intention, but we've pivoted from that direction. And we don't want it or need it because it doesn't provide us value in this part of the journey that we're on, whatever that means. And yet there it is, hanging out. Somebody put a bunch of thought into it at some time. And sometimes they just can go because if it becomes important again, you can just make a new task.
absolutely. And I
Or
try not to
resurrect a
delete.
task. That's always an option.
That's what I was just about to say. I try not to delete anything. I try to mark things as removed so that you have that history because the number of times I've also had conversations where it's like we've had this conversation before and it just feels like A, you're wasting time and B, it starts to contribute to the crazy of like how many times have we had this conversation? I feel like I'm forgetting this is memento.
Right. Yes, the recording of decisions that were made is important along the way, especially when they come back to haunt you later. And with new people in the mix, that's my favorite. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Decision logs. I'm a big proponent of decision logs. Again, I know documentation can be a bad word, but a decision log is something easy that you can throw together and throw decisions out there so that you can keep track. So that again, you're not having those crazy conversations of like, I think we already talked about this. Why did we make this decision? I don't know. And then if you don't know the why, if you don't know why you did certain things, how can you make decisions about what to do next?
Right.
Yeah,
And I find often and people talk a lot about tech debt, but what it really is decision debt. But it's because you made a decision based on information that you had at the time that was the best information you had. You just have new information now. Which,
exactly.
which if you understand that original decision and the information that was available, now you can make a new decision. But if you can never really figure out like why did we pick this in the first place, it makes it very hard to like rip out chunks of code and do, some kind of gnarly, nasty things that really need to be done. Just make a new decision, right? Like,
Right.
hey, there's a new product available that does this for us. We don't need to maintain this in our code anymore. We can import it in a library. But if you don't really realize why that was put there and what it does and who it impacts, you can't, it's harder to get out of it, right?
The why is so important. And I mean, we're supposed to be the voice of the why, right? The product manager. And that's why I advocate for it very strongly. And that's why it's so important in everything, in the decisions that we make, in the products that we pursue and the features that we pursue and how we do everything.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that technical ambassador portion of the product manager role. How do you collaborate with technical teams? I mean, you're in this, I've got one foot in one side, one foot in the other position, speaking two different languages. How do you pull it off?
It's a great question, and it's actually my favorite part of what I do. I love being that ambassador because I love being a little bit technical, but not so much. I know for a fact I don't want to code all day. That is not what I want to do. But I also love working with people, working with stakeholders, and understanding what they want. My background as an analyst proves that. If I didn't do it all the time, I how could I like it? So with that, when I'm collaborating with technical teams, the backlog refinement and the retrospectives are, of course, key activities for the whole team, and that includes the developers and tech leads. But working sessions on like specific features are so key to understanding what is technically possible and what is technically the best approach. Those are absolutely vital. And then it's again going back to the who, the what, and the why. So always being the voice during those collaboration sessions with developers, with technical team members. Who is this for, or who is doing this? What are they doing, and why are they doing it? Why do we need this? And then diagramming is always really nice. I know, technical people can sometimes get into their own heads. So having diagrams or having programs ready to diagram it out, whether it be a systems architecture, whether it be a workflow, whether it be a user journey, whatever it may be, having those diagrams during working sessions often helps. And then again, going back to what we were just talking about, being the voice of the why, like, why is this important? Why do we need to do this? And then what are the constraints? Being very clear, because one of the things that you find with technical team members is they're very like, oh, this new shiny thing, oh, this capability. They get very excited, and that's a good thing. We do not want to discourage that, but we do need to be the guardrails around that. So like, okay, I hear you. This is so exciting. We definitely want this. Why do we want it? What is the value that it's going to bring? Because this is how much it's going to cost. This is the constraints of our budget and timing. So we need to keep all of that in mind. And then you collaborate. That's where collaboration happens. And you let essentially the technical minds determine the how. And you just encourage them to, you work with them to break down the work into smaller and smaller tasks so that you can allow that work to be rolled out incrementally within budget, within timing. And it's just, that's how the collaboration goes.
You brought up an interesting thing there. How do you prevent the desire for stakeholders to define the technical how part? I've
Oh,
seen
that
too many
happens.
tickets
Oh,
that are defined that have the we want this done this way kind of thing, and which turns software developers into code monkeys, right? To just
yes.
coder. They just type at that point. They're not partners in the solution development. They don't get input on, well, the system has this really easy thing we could have used if you hadn't defined you wanted it like this, right? How do you get a handle on that?
It's a challenge, right? Because you get excited when you hear someone say, I want this, and you're like, I want to give it to you. But
Right.
as the product manager, you have to have that, like, okay, what are you actually trying to do? And there's so many different questions that you can ask to define that and determine that. It depends on what they're asking for. So, asking for what impact are you trying to have? What is this thing really trying to do? What impact are you trying to have? What problem are you trying to solve? Like there's a ton of different problems and digging that you can get into, and questions that you can ask once you get answers to those like higher level questions as you're talking to stakeholders. But what you really want is to be, you're kind of an investigator in that way, where you're asking questions that then beget questions, beget questions, beget questions, so that you can deeply understand, what is this person needing? What are they trying to do? And then you can start to pull back and see, okay, this is part of a larger vision for this product. I can see this having these impacts here, or I can totally see that this has no impact. This needs something else. What they're asking for, they're not actually asking for. They need something else, and so on. So it's a matter of being that investigator to ask the questions that will beget more questions and ultimately lead to true understanding of what the goals are.
And my favorite is the one you described at the end, is where they don't actually need what they're asking for. I just want a checkbox, they'll say. And you're like, do you really? Is that really? Well, what are you trying to accomplish with the checkbox? And then you sort of use your five whys technique. Well, why is that the solution you think? Well, what does that solve for you? And you just dig in and you're like, yeah, checkbox is not what we need here. Let me get with the team and see how we can solve this for you.
Of course. You're really just a psychologist in some regards when you're a product manager because you're constantly asking why, how do you feel about that?
And tell me about your mother.
I love
Yeah,
it.
pull a Freud on them. Yeah. Speaking of customers, how do you gather customer feedback? I mean, there's a loop, right? They've defined this thing that they want. The developers have delivered something which meets the definition of done, but may or not meet the intent of what the person actually had. Uh, Customers don't know what they wanted until they see what you've delivered, kind of trick. How do you, and then that feedback needs to go back to developers. And the problem is they usually only get feedback when it's wrong. And I don't hear a lot of, yes, that totally met our need. That got the metrics, right? That got us where we needed to be. Almost rarely ever gets back to the person who wrote it. I think that's a loop in the industry that we need to close. One is often they are asked to do things and they don't understand why. And second, they never really hear what the outcome was. They just move on to the next set of tasks. And that's a little sad. So how do
I hear
you
you.
deal with the stakeholders and the customer feedback in that regard?
That's a really good point that you made at the end there, by the way, is the feedback getting back to the team, the developers, so that they have actionable items to act upon based on the feedback. So what I tend to do is I lean on built-in forms and surveys, both disruptive, where it's like a pop-up when somebody is interacting with your solution, popping up saying, "Hey, how are things going? How do you like the product so far?" There's a couple of different schools of thought around it about like what questions to ask, and it's going to depend on the product and what it's doing, and how you want to track that the success metrics of the product. But there's also like permanent embedded, those like same surveys and forms that are permanently embedded somewhere in the user interface or user experience. I tend to be a big believer in those. And then apart from the built-in stuff like that is the sprint reviews, especially when you have like very involved stakeholders and stakeholders who are willing to listen and be there and be a part of the process of building the product. The sprint reviews are so important. Basically showing, what you've done, giving really detailed demonstrations of what your product does and how it works. Always focusing again on the who, the what, and the why, and making sure that if you're going to get into the weeds, that it's audience appropriate. Just being very aware of who the audience is, how much they know, how much they might not know, and then also sending out those forms again after the sprint reviews or along with the sprint reviews. What I would do is I would send out the recording of the sprint review along with a form to get feedback. Like you're getting that feedback hopefully during the sprint review. But I know sometimes I'm in a situation where I'm like using a piece of software. I'm like, I need a minute to think about like how I feel about this, or I get a new piece of information I need to digest. So sending out a way to asynchronously give feedback, the asynchronous feedback is so important. And so that's why I'm a big believer in whatever you're doing with like, showing what you're doing, what you're thinking of doing, make sure that it comes with a way for the stakeholders to give the feedback asynchronously so that they can think, synthesize, and give really thoughtful feedback based on what you've provided.
Yeah, I think that every problem in the industry is basically communication. And communication is people, which means all technical problems are really just people. And you've mentioned several forms of communication, documentation, video of the review. But one of the core tenets of Agile is that interaction between stakeholders and the developers and that iterative feedback cycle that comes from that, right? That's really the underlying point. I think people take the tenets of Agile and bend them a little bit. People, working software. That's demonstratable increments. I mean, those are the tenets, right? And
Mhm.
following those, these are the best outcomes was what they proved decades ago, right? And that's harder to do than to say.
It
So
it
speaking of, you were mentioning forms and things. let's talk a little bit about tools or strategies that you use to boost productivity in the things that you do. And again, you've mentioned diagrams. I think that's a great boost to communication that succinctly shows things that are oftentimes complicated, like user flows or things like to write that out in prose. I don't want to read that book. Just show me the picture, right? But what are some other tools or strategies that you use uh, to increase productivity in those regards?
Sure. Product management software like Jira and Aha, like those are all great. I know that AI is starting, that's the buzzword, right? It's starting to help with the more repetitive and less strategic tasks, as well as with coding. And just to be clear, I'm not an AI like soothsayer or a snake oil salesman of like AI will fix all of our problems. It's to me it is just another tool, and the key is knowing where to apply it. So but my understanding is that there's a lot that AI can do to help with productivity, automate some of those annoying tasks like scheduling meetings and taking notes during feedback sessions, so that you can focus on the more strategic elements of your job. I'm trying to think what else. Chat capabilities, whether it be through Microsoft Teams or Slack or whatever your preferred tool is always good because I know people tend to say, "Oh, I just need to be able to like walk up to somebody and talk through something." You can do that electronically with any whatever chat platform is your preference or your tool set. And then I personally use like a note program. I'm not particular with anyone, but just somewhere where I can dump all of my brain goblins and thoughts, just like, and then organizing it, just being very thoughtful about my tabs and what's under the tabs and labeling everything. We talking about AI, it's not just data, it's metadata, right? It's the data about the data. That goes for human interacting data as well. I would not be, as organized as I am if I weren't as organized as I am. So that's why I have my OneNote. It has all these different tabs and it's got these little things and all these notes and these keywords in it. It's so that I can go back and go, I know I was thinking about this thing. Let's search for this term and see where it pops up. Oh yeah, right. And it helps me to be more productive and more organized.
Somebody asked me one time, how do you as a software engineering leader organize things in a world of, chaos, basically, right? And that's overseeing the entire technology platform of a company. There's a lot of chaos in there in different places, maybe that you've never poked at before. I said, how do I stay organized? I said, I bring the organization, right? By being organized myself. That's how you do it.
I love that. I love that response. I've never heard that before, and that's wonderful.
It come, I manifest it. It comes from within. Then I beat the rest of it into submission. That's how we do it.
That's really funny. I love
uh,
that.
as we get to the end of our time together, what advice would you give aspiring digital project managers?
That's a great question. I've gotten asked that a few times in the last few months as I've been talking to people who are looking to get into product management. My advice would be, and from the conversations that I've had with a lot of different people looking to do it, is start at the very front of everything with the problems that you want to solve. So, what are you passionate about? Where do you see problems? Where do you think the solutions are? Or what do you think the solutions are? So really get a good understanding of what problems you're passionate about and what problems you want to solve. And then the next step I would say is surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. I can't begin to describe to you how amazing some of the technical leads that I've worked with in my career. I've been so lucky to work with so many amazing, technically minded, like smart people, and then surround yourself with the stakeholders as well, not just the people who are going to make the solution, but the people who need the solution. Surround yourself with those people. Really work to understand their problem, like how they are experiencing the problem and how they need that problem to be solved, or how they think they need that problem to be solved. And then get really good at establishing those relationships, understanding where they come from, their perspectives, and yeah, recognize that your passion is going and your ability to coordinate everything and all the people and put them in the right place and communicate about the solutions and how they work and how they solve the problems for the stakeholders is going to be how you make an impact. And know that there's lots of different ways to get into the product management function, because it's not like a doctor or any of those sorts of disciplines where it's you do this and then this and then this and then you're this. It's There's a lot of different ways to get into it, and it very heavily depends on the industry, on the company, on the function, on the problem that you're trying to solve, on the way in which the problem will be solved, and it's constantly evolving. So definitely focus on the relationships that you're establishing, your understanding of solutions and how to solve those problems, your understanding, the fundamental understanding of the problems, and grow the skills that you want to focus on. Don't force yourself into something that you don't like or don't care about for a title. Just focus on those skills that you will want to be practicing within that function, and you should be good to go.
Yeah, finding the place where you fit, where you're passionate about what you do makes all the difference in your career and in
It
your life.
does. It really does.
Well, with that, on behalf of Jessica and myself, here's wishing all of you a successful tech life. Thanks so much.